Mad Madame Lalaurie, the mistress of the haunted house. She has inspired legends for almost 200 years in New Orleans. But what of the story is true? What can we know from our records and contemporary sources? Well, you may be surprised to learn that most of the story is verifiable, down to her burial in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. But what is more surprising to me is that this is the only story of this kind that has lasted. The documented cruelty by Delphine Lalaurie was not unique. The unique aspect is that we still tell her story. White Creole women in antebellum New Orleans were known for being cruel and torturous, especially to those they enslaved. The truths about Madame Lalaurie do not require any embellishments to turn your stomach. It is a questionable fact of the human species that we are drawn to the goriest and most grotesque stories. This bloodlust is revealed in the fact that white Creole women were known for being particularly cruel to their enslaved people. The theories on why this is true has been and will be debated. We will discuss the legends, and I will share the truth. Knowing what is documented tends to turn my stomach more than the hyperbole we can roll our eyes at. You have been warned. Another quirk of Louisiana that makes this retelling of the documentation possible is our reliance on civil law instead of English common law. This arose from the importance of the port. When the Louisiana Territory became American, there were already so many contracts and legal filings and lawyers to untangle that they basically decided not to untangle it. This one will be different, they said, and they left us to continue recording and notarizing all transactions as required by the less common civil law, sometimes referred to as Napoleonic law. Another oddity is the prevalence or requirement of Catholicism in Louisiana before freedom of religion reigned in the American takeover. The Catholic Church records all sacraments, and all citizens of the colony had to be Catholic by law. Through these records, we can piece together life stories, when they were born through baptismal records, when they married, what property they bought and sold, their involvement within trading enslaved people, and anything else that may have been notarized. So while the legends of Delphine are many, we can piece together some truths about her life and why she has become so infamous in history. Let's start with the legends. Madame Lalaurie, who lived at 1140 Royal Street, was a premier socialite in New Orleans from an old Creole family. Her husband, Dr. Lalaurie, was a doctor. There were rumors of unusual cruelty toward her enslaved people, but investigations yielded only glowing reports of Delphine's charming nature. During a party one night, her home caught fire, and when the fire brigade arrived to assist, she requested rudely that instead of rescuing her enslaved people, they rescue her antique furniture. They refused her requests and discovered the mutilated and tortured people that Delphine had enslaved. 7 people were rescued that night, and they were brought to the Cabildo for treatment and food. Meanwhile, an angry crowd gathered around the fire-consumed home and dismantled what didn't burn. Madame Delphine escaped via coach to Lake Pontchartrain, where she met a schooner and alighted to the North Shore, and eventually on to Mobile, where she fled for Paris and spent her remaining days in exile. Her escape from justice hangs heavy over the property. After she fled, many bones were discovered in the courtyard and well at the Royal Street property. One was of a young enslaved girl named Leah, who is said to have hit a snag in Delphine's hair while she was brushing it. Delphine became so enraged, and Leah was so scared, that she chased her to the gallery, and the girl jumped to her death to avoid the punishment at the hands of Delphine. The girl's bones are said to be among those found. The bricked-up window is said to be where she jumped from. Since Delphine was run out of New Orleans, this home has served as a conservatory of music and a school and a furniture store, as well as the private residence of Nicolas Cage for a while. But no one is said to be able to remain here for long, as the ghosts of the tortured enslaved people who lived here have not been able to cross from this realm, or let anyone who stays there long rest as they were prevented from doing. Delphine never returned to New Orleans in life, but she was interred in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, and a decaying plaque noting her burial was discovered in the 1940s on a tomb. Let me know in the comments if I missed a detail you know. How much of this can we account for? Surprisingly, a lot of it was documented in the contemporary times. I won't be diving into any of the accounts that attempt to defend Delphine. We have far too much evidence to consider it likely that this was some kind of smear campaign against her family. In addition, as I've mentioned, this type of cruelty was not necessarily unique to Delphine. She had at least one relative who was also credibly accused of killing her enslaved people. The torture and fire at 1140 Rue Royale happened. There is little doubt. So let's dive into the story of Madame Lalaurie and the haunted house on Rue Royale. We'll go point by point to show what we know to be true and what we think is likely based on the documented sources. To do this, I used Carolyn Moreau-Long's 2012 book, Madame Lalaurie, as my source. She has gone through all of the known documentation to find the details we know to be true, and this is the definitive book on the topic, as of today. Starting with the villain, Madame Lalaurie. She was in fact a socialite who was from an old Creole family well known in New Orleans. She was born Delphine McCarty in 1787 in the midst of rebellions of enslaved people in Louisiana and Saint-Domingue. Her family had a plantation just south of the city. It was where the Press Street train tracks lie currently. This location is infamous as where Homer Plessy was arrested for sitting in a white car of the train, leading to the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which codified Jim Crow segregation until Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 overturned it. Her plantation was where these tracks are, and this area was known as Faubourg Delphine when she began selling it off, until the railroad company purchased some of it and it became a train yard. Where the plantation house stood, there is a World War I Victory Arch in a green space known as McCarty Square. Delphine married thrice. She was first married to Ramon Lopez y Angulo de la Candelaria when she was 13 in 1800. He was 35 and a widower. 4 years later, the Republic of Haiti was established after the successful revolt of enslaved people on Saint-Domingue that had lasted much of Delphine's life. Her first husband, Lopez, died in Cuba the same year after a ship ran aground while they were on their way to Madrid. Days later, she gave birth to her first child, Borgia, who was named after her dead husband's first wife. Lopez was known as being the Spanish official who reopened the African slave trade in Louisiana, even with the fear of rebellion that loomed over the colony. Delphine returned to New Orleans with her child. She wed her second husband, Jean Blanque, in 1807, shortly after her mother died. Her mother was not murdered by those she enslaved. However, her uncle, Baptiste César Le Breton, was murdered by those he enslaved in 1771, more than a decade before Delphine was born. Jean Blanque was a well-respected figure in New Orleans. He was the go-between for Jean Lafitte and Governor Claiborne during the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. Jean was known as a shrewd businessman, and he was involved in the politics of the city. He was a director of the Bank of Louisiana and bought the property next door, which is now 409 Royal Street. The couple split their time between this property and their plantation, known as Villa Blanque, near the property she grew up on below the city. They had 4 children, Pauline, Laure, Jean, and Pauline. In a letter from Claiborne, the territorial governor, to Thomas Jefferson, he wrote, "Mr. Jean Blanque resides near New Orleans and is a merchant in high credit. About 3 years ago, he married a very beautiful Creole lady possessing a large estate and connected with one of the most numerous and respectable families in the county of Orleans. Mr. Blanque is a man of genius and education and possesses considerable influence in the city. He is a member of the City Council, a director of the Louisiana Bank, and has been for the last 3 years a member of the House of Representatives for the territory. Mr. Blanque is much disliked by most of the Native Americans residing in and near New Orleans. His attachments are supposed to be wholly foreign, and they consider him a dangerous man." Slightly ironic that Jean Blanque and the Lafitte brothers sided with the Americans during the battle. Without their assistance, it's likely that New Orleans would have been taken by the British, even though this battle occurred after the war was over. Shortly after the Battle of New Orleans, Jean Blanque died in 1815. He was 50 years old, and Delphine was now 28 and a widow again. Enslaving people was common among the upper-class society of New Orleans at this time, and it was expected by people like Delphine. They literally could not maintain their lifestyles without unpaid labor making it happen on a daily basis. Delphine owned at least 54 people throughout her life that we can account for, but it was her union with Jean Blanque that saw her trafficking in people increase. It seems that one of his primary sources of income was in the slave trades, and he died with a considerable debt. Delphine worked to settle his estate. While she did emancipate at least one person during this time at Jean's request in his will, 8 others died under her watch during this time after Blanque died and before she met her third and final husband. Their deaths were recorded without cause at St. Louis Cathedral. They were primarily women and children. In 1824, Delphine's money troubles from Jean Blanque were alleviated by the death of her father. He left her and her brother a considerable estate. He also included his child with a free woman of color in his will, who received $5,000 and 2 slaves. 1824 is also the year Dr. Louis Lalaurie arrived in New Orleans from France. He had just finished his training as a physician at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1823, but he was not from a prominent family. His expertise was in treating orthopedic conditions such as hunchbacks. He was told by his father to find a wealthy woman to marry in New Orleans to help raise the prominence of his family. This brings us to 1825, the year Delphine and Dr. Louis Lalaurie meet. She was a wealthy woman, both by inheritance and at this time by her own business acumen. She was a grandmother and 38 years old. Louis was 22. Their son, Jean-Louis, was born in 1827, and the couple finally wed after the doctor returned from a visit to France in 1828. In 1831, they acquired a partially built townhouse at the corner of Hospital and Royal Streets in the city for their residence. Before we finish exploring the documented story of Delphine, I want to examine our fixation on antebellum stories as the basis of our horror and ghost fetish in the modern times. While I was searching for portraits of Delphine and her 3 husbands, I found this book, Tales from the Haunted South, Dark Tourism, and Memories of Slavery from the Civil War Era by Tiya Miles. Dr. Miles analyzes the story of Delphine, as well as Carolyn Morolong's interpretation of the evidence and the modern conception of the story through ghost tours. She points out that we wouldn't have ghost tours of the 9/11 memorial, as that would be considered distasteful by all. Indeed, Mary Millen is one of the figures in Long's book who conducts a seance and claims to speak with the ghosts of the enslaved people who died there in the epilogue. She calls herself Bloody Mary, as well as a priestess and queen of voodoo. She was also widely criticized in 2018 for creating the Haunted History Museum and a tour she holds of an apartment where a gruesome murder-suicide occurred in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. But this tour still exists in a city where friends of the victims still live. In my research, I have noticed over and over again that the figures who still captivate our attention hundreds of years later all knew each other. Pontalba, Almonaster, the Lafitte brothers, Marie Laveau, Père Antoine, and Delphine Lalaurie all lived in the same New Orleans. All of the stories come from the same half-century or so, when people were allowed to own other people of African descent. And much of the horror in the stories focuses specifically on the violence against the enslaved, violence that is not legally possible today. In a world where the common story was once one of genteel dominance that did not involve violence through lost-cause efforts at rewriting history, we have swung to fetishizing the violence against Black and brown bodies in the past, while distancing ourselves from the violence of today. Dr. Miles points out that this is a form of othering. We can remove ourselves from the violence of the past because we do not allow that behavior now. While we can tolerate the cruelty and horror because it is not possible now, the same way that Delphine is always described as Creole and not just white or American, enslavers are other than us, the civilized people of today. I am guilty of this in my own retelling. In the first part of this story, I always described Delphine as Creole, which in Delphine's time would have meant someone who was born in Louisiana to parents who were born elsewhere. This is another rewriting of the facts, as Dr. Miles points to numerous sources in the evidence that show that Creole women weren't particularly cruel toward those they enslaved. White women, in general, were. As I pointed out in part 1, white women, Creole or not, were violent by all evidence. It was not abnormal at all. Delphine is doubly othered in the ghost story to make her mad and Creole, and definitely not like the other slavers. But the truth is she was just like the other slavers. Dr. Miles also carefully points out that the crowds that destroy the Lalaurie mansion are described simply as being of all classes and colors in the newspaper accounts. It's unlikely that other high society slave-owning white people destroyed her residence because they could not tolerate her crimes. We have plenty of evidence that they were guilty of the same or similar crimes, including in the contemporary accounts that describe the crowds being stopped by the sheriff to prevent the same destruction of more slave owners. More likely, it was abolitionists who expressed their outrage. Abolition was gaining momentum in the North around the time of the fire. In the Boston Post, we get this account. Quote, "The mob assembled again on Friday night with a view to complete their work of destruction and to wreak their vengeance on other persons accused of being guilty of similar conduct to that of Madame Lalaurie. But the authorities were on the watch, the alarm was given, and a part of the Legion and the U.S. troops were soon under arms and on the field of action." Mr. Holland, the deputy sheriff, read the riot act to the crowd, which soon dispersed and perfect order has been restored, and we hope may never again be disturbed by a like impolitic and dangerous movement, not to be excused in this city, even by the scandalous outrages that gave rise to it. Unquote. With this in mind, let's continue the story of Delphine and why her story has lasted through time. The townhouse at the corner of Hospital and Royal Streets was always in her name in the records. She and Louis lived there until 1832, when Delphine petitioned for a separation from Lalaurie, and it was granted. From letters one of her neighbors sent to his family in France, we learned that Delphine's marriage to Louis was notoriously unhappy. One of her claims in the separation petition was, quote, "On the 26th of October last, 1832, in the presence of many witnesses, the said Louis Lalaurie went so far as to not only ill-treat her, but even to beat and wound her in the most outrageous and cruel manner." Unquote. It seems that perhaps her vicious nature was not only common among white women, but white men as well. Dr. Miles posits that the protection of white men from the historical narrative of cruelty as represented in stories like Delphine's is a way of maintaining the paternalistic and patriarchal hierarchy of antebellum times. In some accounts of the torture at the Lalaurie mansion, history has rewritten the story again so that the doctor was experimenting on those he enslaved, leading to the appearance of torture. After Delphine separated from him, Louis went on to live in a rural Plaquemines parish, and not much is known about what he did there. However, the neighbors noted that the marriage of the Lalauries was exceptionally dramatic, and their separations and reconciliations were well known. The doctor did return to the Royal Street home and participated in business transactions with his wife after the separation. He was also present the day of the fire. On April 10, 1834, during the morning, the kitchen, which was an outbuilding attached to the two-story mansion, caught fire. The Lalauries' across-the-street neighbor was Judge Jacques-Francois Canage, who observed them removing valuables in case the main building also caught fire. He suggested that they, quote, "have the slaves removed to a place of safety," unquote. Dr. Lalaurie was quoted in the newspaper to have replied in an insulting tone, quote, "There are persons who would do much better by remaining at home than visiting others to dictate to them laws in the quality of officious friends." The newspaper reported that Judge did not abide by this request and instead ordered that they break down the doors. 7 tortured people were discovered, chained, mutilated, starved, and inhumanely brutalized. They brought them to the columns under the Cabildo for treatment and to become a human zoo. Some accounts say 2,000 people viewed them. Some say it was 4,000 who viewed the people who received the violence of the Lalauries. Regardless, thousands of people bore witness to the violent and secret spectacle revealed by the fire at the Lalaurie mansion. Modern tours, such as that of Gallagher House nearby and the Herman Grima House on St. Louis Street, focus on the experience of the enslaved. These urban enslavement tours go out of their way to distinguish the ways in which urban enslavement was different than the plantation slavery most people are familiar with. On both of these tours, the guides explain that the enslaved on plantations were given different treatment. For instance, on plantations, they may be expected to grow their own food in small gardens they tended, while those in the city would be nourished better by the leftovers of their owners' meals, or that they would be clothed in better clothes to keep up appearances. The reasoning they both explained is that living in close quarters of the city and the expectations of their neighbors, as well as the Code Noir dictation of how enslaved should be treated, forced them to ensure that their enslaved people were well-fed and well-dressed and presentable in ways that plantation slavery did not require. However, Dr. Miles explains that, quote, in Savannah and other southern port cities, urban slavery and rural slavery were inextricably linked, such that plantation owners had regular business in town and put their slaves to work in either location. Unquote. Either 1 or 2 of the 7 people who were rescued from the fire died shortly after. Newspapers report both. What happened to the remaining 5 or 6 people is not documented. Any stories that explain what happened to them aren't based on documented evidence. What is documented, dozens of times, across the world, was the story of Delphine Lalaurie and the fire at her mansion. I found articles from newspapers across the country and beyond recounting the scandalous story to their readers, many simply reprinting stories from New Orleans papers like a wire service would today. The story was told and retold for months, making it a 19th century example of a viral news story. The story has never, in almost 200 years, been cured of the virus. After the fire, the property was purchased and rebuilt in 1837. In 1894, the numbering system changed in the French Quarter, so the address was originally 282 Royal Street. The house we see today at the corner of what was formerly Hospital Street but is now Governor Nichols Street was only 2 stories when it was built. The 3rd story was added later in the 19th century, according to the Historic New Orleans collection. So that bricked-up window that Delphine chased her young enslaved girl Leah out of? More likely, it was an architectural choice or a change inside of the house that left a blocked window, since there was no 3rd story in Delphine's time, and the house burned. Delphine really did escape to Paris and live the rest of her life in exile in France. She really was buried in Paris and then exhumed and reburied in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, according to Long's examination of the documentation. The grave with a plaque discovered in the 1940s was purchased by Paul and Blanque, Delphine's son, with Jean Blanque, shortly before she was buried there. He had inherited a huge estate after his mother's death, along with his siblings, and was capable of pulling off any memorial he chose, no matter how exceptional. The plaque was misread to show her death as 1842 because of the corrosion, but she died in 1849, probably of illness. Sometimes tours will explain her death as a dramatic run-in with a boar on a hunting trip. While French death records never reveal the cause of death, she had been sick for some time, according to correspondence from her children, who lived with her in Paris. Of her 6 children, Borgia, Pauline, Laure, Jean, Paulin, and Jean-Louis, Pauline, Laure, and Paulin, and Jean-Louis all lived with her in Paris. Pauline, Laure, and Jean-Louis had been present the day of the fire in New Orleans. Paulin was studying at Princeton at the time. Neither Pauline nor Laure married. Paulin and Jean-Louis did not work while they were in Paris, so all remained reliant on their mother. This was directly resultant from the fire and reveal of the torture, according to Long's interpretation. The home has had many owners over the years and served as many different types of businesses or establishments. Individuals began capitalizing on the legends of the haunted house almost immediately, with Harriet Martineau's 1836 account in her Retrospect of Western Travel. She interviewed eyewitnesses to the tragedy. She witnessed the building still in destruction during her New Orleans visit, as it wasn't rebuilt until 1837. In 1845, it first became a school, Franklin High School. In 1862, it was purchased by a music teacher. In 1869, it became a business. In 1872, it became a school again, this time Lower Girls High School, which was a racially mixed school for girls that existed peacefully for a couple of years before white suits forced those of African descent out with no regulation from the superintendent or police. The Lower Girls High School moved in 1878 and closed in 1879. Then, the mansion became the home of the New Orleans Conservatory of Music. The location became an apartment building and was home to fruit and vegetable vendors of Sicilian and Italian descent in the 1880s and 1890s, when the French Quarter was Piccolo Palermo. In 1893, Fortunato Greco, an Italian immigrant, procured the building and soon noticed the public's interest in seeing ghosts. He is seemingly the first owner to capitalize on the haunted house. He drew crowds who paid 10 cents each. The Haunted House Exchange Saloon was opened between 1895 and 1909. Greco sold the building in 1916, and it continued as an apartment building where tenants would charge curious visitors to see the ghosts. Apparently, during this time, they would clank chains and dress in sheets to help the illusion along. In 1922, William Jennings Warrington opened a lunch house and then purchased the building in 1923. The mansion became the Warrington House in 1924, which was a shelter for men and boys experiencing homelessness. Warrington perpetuated and expanded the myths of the haunted house. Warrington sold to an organization of 32nd degree Masons of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite called the Grand Consistory of Louisiana in 1932. But the Warrington House continued until 1942, and the Masons never used the building. It was next used as an apartment building again through the 1960s. From 1969 until 2000, it was again a private residence of a radiologist who restored the property. He sold to another out-of-town private owner who then sold to Nicolas Cage in 2006, who ended up losing it to foreclosure in 2009. It was last sold in 2010 to another private investor who renovated the building but allows it to sit empty and unopened to visitors as of this 2023 retelling. People often try to explain Delphine's extreme cruelty by pointing to trauma she could blame on people of color. Some of these reasons include her parents were murdered by the enslaved people they owned. She resented her father for having children with women of color and leaving portions of his estate to them. Or she resented women of color because her husbands had affairs with them, among others. But evidence shows that none of this victim blaming is correct. It's much more likely that Delphine was just a very typical product of her time, fulfilling the expectations of a person of her status and not questioning the harm she caused. The truths about Southern antebellum race-based slavery are so horrific that we have painted a case that went viral in 1834 as an extreme. Unfortunately, she was not extreme. She was typical. She was just exposed. It makes you question all that we have accepted in the modern times without a critical analysis that will be the horror stories of the future. Thank you for joining me on another dive into one of New Orleans' most famous ghost stories. Please like and subscribe for more stories from the deep. Coming soon.